And the reality is it's going to be advice we may not like. And part of the reason it's advice we may not like is it's what I would call a blanket statement. You know, these big kind of sweeping statements that you should do this no matter what, whenever this happens, or all those people, those blanket statements. And all those blanket statements, when we really pull them apart, even though we may be on the one side of the blanket statements, the reality is they just feel so insensitive. They seem so simple, right? They seem too simple. They seem so definitive, so precise, right? Because again, we have our stories. And we're like, it seems, how do we take some advice, especially advice that was written 2,000 years ago, that doesn't know our story, doesn't know the situation in which we live, and how does that really work and apply to us? But if you feel that way as we read this section of the Bible this morning together, let me just say something as your friend and as your pastor. It would be foolish to not take this seriously. And the reason not to take, I would say, be foolish is this is that advice that you hear that you're like, right? And you know it's good advice, but we kind of resist it. It's in that category. And it comes from a guy by the name of James that we don't know a ton about. All we really know about this particular guy named James, there's a bunch of guys named James, especially in the New Testament part of the Bible. All we know about him is he was one of Jesus' brothers. And at some point, it sounds like probably after Jesus' death, this gruesome death and resurrection, that something changes in his heart and in his mind. And he becomes this follower of his brother, which I want you just to think about your brother or sister at this moment. What would it take for you to believe that they were the Savior of the world? Yeah, some of us have got like brothers and sisters like nothing. There is nothing that could convince me that he or she is it, right? It's like, but James may have had that thought before, but at some point he becomes his follower. And we don't know whether it's because of his connection with Jesus that he rises up. He becomes one of the leaders, the key leaders in the church in Jerusalem. And what we discover that when James writes this particular letter, and it's sort of a letter that's intended to go out to all these followers of Jesus, primarily Jewish followers of Jesus, because that's the community that James was from. What happens is James at this moment was leading the community in crisis when he wrote these words. And that's important to keep in mind because they're going to seem, again, very insensitive. We have to remember, he's in a situation, and he's writing to them to try to encourage them in this situation. Because the reality is, during those 30 years, things did not go well. In fact, if you've read much of the part of the Bible we call the New Testament, especially Paul's letters, you discover that Paul is oftentimes asking for money. And he's not asking for money for himself. He's asking for money for the believers in Jerusalem because things had been going not so well for them. Because once they became a follower of Jesus, they got ostracized, they got cut off from the community. Some of them lost business, some of them lost their jobs, some of them lost their family, their friends. And life became really, really hard. So hard that Paul, as he's out visiting lots of people, is asking people, hey, can we help out this community? This community is sort of where, this faith started, Jerusalem, this big kind of focal point for them. And it's in that context of things not going well that James will pen some words that, again, can seem so insensitive to us, right? And here's the crazy thing. His advice may have seemed insensitive to them, even to them. 2,000 years ago, the people who he was most related to, most connected with. Because here's what James wrote. And again, it sounds like so, blanket statement, so precise, so easy, so simple. He writes this: when you have many kinds of trouble, when you have many kinds of trials and testing. And I want you to notice the first word is the word when. Not if, but the first kind of thing, right? Because we were much of an if, right? But like when James is writing much like his brother who said, in this world you will have trouble, right? The promise that nobody ever claims from Jesus. James writes, listen, when, not if, but when. When you have, and the word there have carries the idea in the original language of being surprised by it. It's that, that knock on the door early in the morning and the police officer standing there. It's that phone call you get. It's that email, that text that changes your life. It's that conversation that happens that you weren't expecting to happen, and it's happened, and now everything's changed. The bottom's dropped out. It's the results of that test, whether in school academically or whether medically, that comes back. And it's not the result you wanted. It's that, that firing, that loss of a job. When you are surprised by the many kinds of trials and troubles, that might be a better way to put it. When you're surprised by the many trials and testing that comes to your life, the ones that we can't pray away, the ones we can't obey away, because sometimes people just say, you just need to, be more devout. That'll fix it. The ones we can't faith away, this isn't an issue about how much faith you have. When you are surprised by the stuff that hits your life, consider it all, here's the thing that seems so insensitive. Consider it all pure joy. Now, if you're not a religious person, you're not kind of a Jesus person, you're thinking, what are these foolish people listening to, right? Because it's like, how insensitive. I mean, he doesn't know our story. He doesn't know what we're going through. How can he write these words that when I'm facing the stuff that I'm currently facing, I'm supposed to consider it not just all joy, but pure joy. But a little insight comes from the guy that we've been looking at throughout this series called Mark Manson, kind of a psychologist background. He's approaching sociologically how we kind of look and deal with life. Here's what he wrote in The Most Important Question of Your Life, online blog. He said, to get good at dealing with negative experiences is to get good at dealing with life, period. Again, seems like a pretty insensitive thing to say, right? But I think Mark recognizes, again, not a religious person, recognizes what James is writing about. That life is filled with lots of negative stuff. And the better we get at handling that negative stuff, as opposed to ignoring that, avoiding that negative stuff, the better we get at dealing with life, which means the better we'll have a life. Consider it all pure joy. But he doesn't finish there, thankfully. He says, because you know. So James is saying, listen, we know something, right? And here's the question we need to ask ourselves. What if there's something we know that we've just lost sight of? When he writes those words, when something surprises you and you're like caught off guard, you ought to be happy about it, you ought to be joyful about it because you know something. You know that these troubles test your faith. I think for a lot of us, when we hear the word test, we revert back to our school days, right? A test, to pass, fail. Did I get a good enough grade? Am I going to graduate? Am I going to get a good enough job? All the weight of that idea of a test. That's not the test he's talking about. Because what if this isn't about passing a test, but what the test reveals? Because another kind of testing is the kind of testing that determines the authenticity of something, right? We're going to test it to make sure it's true, that it's authentic, it's real. And as James writes these words, the authenticity he's talking about is the authenticity of our faith. That when this stuff surprises you, you ought to be happy because you know that it reveals the authenticity of your faith. Whether our confidence in God is real or not so much, right? And isn't there some joy in discovering how real our faith actually is? Because wouldn't it be good to discover our faith is not as strong as we thought it was when it's not a really big deal, as opposed to like a dramatically big deal? So that maybe we can rethink about this whole faith thing before we hit one of those troubles that James says will happen, not if it happens, but when it happens. But James doesn't finish there. He says, listen, when you're caught off guard, you ought to be happy, you ought to be joyful, right? Because it tests your faith. And you know this, right? And this testing, this authenticity that comes out will give you perseverance, will give you endurance. That those struggles we go through produce something in us. And what if? What if it's not that the process is enjoyable, but that the discovery is valuable? That one's worth taking a picture of. You're taking a picture of anything. That one you ought to take a picture. I'm going to get Drake while you do that, all right? Because I think we get caught up on the pure joy aspect of it, right? Consider it all joy. How can we be joyful about it? But what if we're joyful for, again, what the discovery is, how valuable that is to us? To know, as opposed to just think it's true or believe it's true. Back to Mark Manson again. He writes, pain is a part of life. Accept it, live through it, learn from it. Which again sounds kind of harsh. Sounds a little bit like James, right? But notice what he goes on. Then growth will show up quietly, almost as if by accident. And isn't it true that over time, if you got enough mileage on you, that you discover that going through stuff has actually helped you go through other stuff? And sometimes, it's because it didn't go so well before. Sometimes it's because, you kind of persevered through it. You can't avoid pain, but you can stop making everything about you. That's where peace begins. Maybe readjusting, why me? Not asking the question, why me? Just accepting, why me? Because everybody else is like us, right? When you have troubles, not if. But James didn't finish there. He says, so here's his recommendation. He says, let your perseverance, let your endurance have its full effect. Let this process finish its work in your life. Basically, he's saying, don't bail out early. Because let's be honest, for some of us, we're wired that way, right? As soon as something gets a little tough, we're out of there, right? I don't need this foolishness. We kind of walk away. We just kind of extract ourselves from the situation. And James is like, don't do that. This isn't a personality trait. This isn't how you wire trait. This is a bigger thing than that. This is something that all of us need to do. He's not speaking to those that have these great, willpower kind of people. He's talking to all people. Don't bail out early. Because what if the struggle we want removed is the struggle we need? Think about this. What if the tension in our life is the epicenter of God's activity in our life? What if the stuff you're going right now is actually evidence that God is at work in your life? Even though you're like, no, it can't be, Mike. You don't know what I'm going through, right? And I probably don't know what you're going through. But sometimes we forget, as James would say. You know this. Sometimes it's in the very hard stuff of life that we discover stuff that we couldn't and wouldn't discover without those moments. I love this next statement from Mark Manson. He says, the best way to become the person you want to be is to put yourself in a situation where you have no choice but to become them. Right? If you really want to become this, right? Put yourself in a situation where you're forced because you have to do that stuff to get there. Which brings us to another what if question. I got a bunch of them today. What if trials don't just demonstrate something, but produce something? What if that's the rationale of them, right? Not to just demonstrate God's presence, but actually they're designed to produce something in us. And James would simply say, what they're producing is this idea of perseverance, of endurance. And you don't have to go run a marathon to do it. See, trials and struggles force us to become something. Every trial that you've gone through, every struggle you've gone through has changed you somehow, right? Some of us have scars, some of us have limps in our life because of the stuff we've gone through, right? So we've become something from that. We've become, an invalid from some of those things. But some of us have become even stronger because of those things. Then James keeps going. He says, listen, then after you let this stuff kind of work out in your life, as you don't bail out early, you keep going through the process, then you will be perfect and complete. You'll be mature and whole is another way to say it. And you will have everything you need. You will lack nothing, which he's not talking about possessions here, folks. He's talking about skills for life, right? Our problem is we're a little uncomfortable, let's be honest, some of us with being mature. Some of us are afraid of adulting. And you don't have to be, in your 20s to be afraid or 30s to be afraid of adulting. I know some 60-year-olds that are afraid of adulting, right? Have never adulted in their life and are still not sure what it looks like. Because again, the responsibilities scare them, right? And what if this is about reframing our struggles in a way that we begin to see them as beneficial? What if James is talking about rethinking how we think about this, reframing how we make this argument and discussion in our lives? We begin to see them not as all these bad things. And I'm not saying they aren't bad things, they aren't traumatic things. But what if we saw them as they are a part of life that everybody has to go through? And other people have gone through these things and come out the other side. What if there's some benefit to them that maybe we don't see in the moment, often we don't see in the moment? But what if that belief that there will be some benefit from this. It might just be enough to help us lean into it and not walk away from it. Because when we face trials, we discover something about ourselves and about our faith and ultimately about God. That again, we wouldn't and couldn't discover any other way. But back to the idea about maturity. Our problem is we don't want maturity, we want relief. Right? We want, stuff happens and we're like, God, please, 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 right? Take it away, get it away, out of here. Just, not take this out of my life. And I love how James recognizes, I think, not only in his audience back then, but even in us today, how we respond to this, right? Because we're like, how can you do that, right? How can you rethink those things? How can you change the way we react to experience, especially, if we've gone through our whole life reacting a certain way and now we're going to change our way about that? But notice what James wrote next, and I think he did it intentionally as he was talking about a topic he knew would be really weighty and heavy for not only his audience, but maybe other people who would read this, not thinking 2,000 years ahead of time, but here we are. But if any of you needs or lacks wisdom, you should ask God for it. If you need some help getting your mind around this, of accepting this, of sort of, somehow working this out in your life, ask God, right? If you need some wisdom again is recognizing how connected life is, right? Well, it isn't just about being smart, it's about being wise about how things work. So we should ask God for it, he writes. And here's the reason he says, listen, you got to ask God for it because God's generous to everyone. And everyone means everyone, including you, right? And me, yes, thank you for you. He's generous with everyone and will give you wisdom ungrudgingly without finding fault. In other words, God isn't sitting up there thinking, well, you asked for wisdom, but I know you're not going to follow it, so I'm not going to give it to you. Not how James goes in this, right? He says, God isn't like, I'd give it to you, but you're just going to waste it, so why put it? No, God's going to give it to you without any kind of judgment, without finding fault. He wants people to be wise, because I think God recognizes that if we're wiser about how life works, we'll discover life how it really works. But James, I'm going to be fair, I was going to leave these next couple sentences out, but I thought, no, I'm always about context, and so I need to be fair to everybody, put it in the context, right? Because James does give a caveat, and it's not about whether we'll respond to the wisdom. He goes a whole different way. He says, listen, but when you ask God, you must believe and not doubt. In other words, don't say, God, give me wisdom, even though I don't think you're going to give me any wisdom. Or God, give me wisdom, but I don't think I got anything later, Or something's happening, it doesn't seem to be magic. It's not magic, folks. You need to believe, you need to trust. That if you've asked God for wisdom, he's going to supply wisdom. It may not come in the form or the direction you think it will. But it'll get there. Need to trust and not doubt. It says of those that are kind of, doubting about this whole thing, they should not expect they will receive anything from the Lord. Which again sounds, sort of cut and dried, right? A little harsh maybe, but his point is, listen, if you don't believe you're going to get it, you're not going to get it, right? Because you've sort of shut off that door. Then he finishes strong. He says, listen, when people are tempted, and in spite of all that, they still continue strong, they should be happy, right? Literally, it says, blessed is the one who perseveres and endures trials. So if you want to say, you're one of those people that loves to use the word blessed, now I have a blessed life. Blessing means to be persevering and enduring trials, according to James. And again, I think Mark Manson, this non-religious person, I think captures the essence of what James was trying to communicate to us 2,000 years ago. He says, listen, be grateful for your struggles, because within them is the opportunity for growth and meaning. That thing you've been complaining about for the last 6 months, try finding a reason to be glad it happened. Which is like, really, Mark? That seems so insensitive, right? But again, it's sort of the James approach, right? What if that thing we've been complaining about is really the thing we ought to be being grateful about? Because maybe it's doing something again in us. Because it's the only way to do that thing in us. So here's the question. Have we been avoiding a struggle that might give our life more meaning? Because it's uncomfortable, because we just don't want to deal with it, because we've been avoiding it. But what if through that process, we've missed out on something? Something not only that God wants to give, but just something that we would appreciate if we got it. What if we were more grateful for our struggles? And when I say being grateful, I'm talking about how Mark Manson is casting this, right? About being appreciative. And how James says that blessed are those that endure those things. Because James goes on and says, listen, after they have proved their faith, after they've stood and endured, God will reward them with life forever. And James' point isn't this is the carrot out there, this is the goal, get to life forever. He's just saying, this is how it's going to work. This is how it works. Because when you have trouble, these surprises in life, you're going to have them. And if somehow you can endure through those with your faith surviving and maybe even your faith getting stronger and stronger, that'll get you to a place where God will welcome you into his home. Not because you've earned it there, but you've trusted him enough with your life. Back to Mark Manson. Everything worthwhile in life is won through surmounting the associated negative experience. I'm going to pause between these because I think this is important stuff. Everything. Any attempt to escape the negative, to avoid it or quash it or silence it, only backfires. And some of us have had that experience very dramatically, right? The avoidance of suffering is a form of suffering. I'm going to let that work around for a second. Think about it. The avoidance of suffering is a form of suffering. Because now we're suffering because we have to avoid it, right? The avoidance of a struggle is a struggle. The denial of a failure is a failure. Again, the very thing we're trying to avoid ends up becoming the thing we're trying to avoid. Pain is an inextricable thread in the fabric of life. And to tear it out is not only impossible, but destructive. Attempting to tear it out unravels everything else with it. I would call Mark's comment there a wise statement, because Mark is putting it in the context of how life is all connected. And though we always kind of convince ourselves, no, it isn't, Mike. I got my thing over here I do. Nobody knows about it. Nobody does it. And I'm over here. I keep my work life separate from my family life, from my fun life. They're all connected. They're all connected, and there are people within this space, in this room, that could tell you stories about how they thought that way, and something happened in this one little area. And it was like pulling that thread, and everything unraveled in life. They lost their jobs. They lost their homes, they lost their families, all because of this one little area. But let's be honest. I want to talk specifically to those of us that are, followers of Jesus now. Let's be honest. Normally our response when stuff goes wrong, goes hard in life, right? When that surprising thing happens that James writes about, right? Here's how we normally respond. We say things like, God, fix it, right? Please, we'll start praying. Maybe we haven't prayed too much, but now we're like faithful prayer people, right? Pray, please fix it. Or God, stop it, right? Just stop it. Because I believe you're almighty, all powerful, you can do miracles. The miracle I need is you to stop this thing. Stop it before it gets out. Stop before it gets worse. God, I just need you to remove it. And if you remove this from my life would be so much better. And Jesus, honestly, I would follow you with everything then. This thing is really standing in the way between me and my following you. So please remove it, right? We all work the angles. God, make it better, faster, right? None of we want it better. We want it fast. Like right now, right? Because some of us are the type that we pray about something really big, and it's like we get 24 hours later, it's like, God, really? Where are you at, right? You let me down. I asked you to fix this thing, and you're a God of miracles. You ought to be standing. Why aren't you doing something fast? Our problem is simply this. We want life on the other side of the struggle. We don't want the struggle that gets us there. And what if God's way to fixing it, stopping it, removing it, making it better is by making us stronger instead? Which is sort of James's point, right? That if you stick with it, it produces something. It produces endurance, perseverance in life, which will make you stronger to be able to be better prepared when, not if, those surprises drop into your lap in life. Mark Manson again. I wanted the reward and not the struggle. And he's talking about a little bit about his, what he was trying to figure out in life and do in life. He says, listen, I wanted the result and not the process. I was in love not with the fight, but only the victory. And life doesn't work that way. Even though we all kind of wish it did, right? We wish we could, have the results from the struggle without all the struggle. Who you are is defined by the values you are willing to struggle for. If you've been here the last few weeks, we've been talking about this regularly, right? Who we are is defined by the values we're worth struggling for. And he writes on, listen, this is not a call for willpower or grit. This isn't about who's, got the greatest self-control in this space. This is not another admonition of no pain, no gain. This is the most simple and basic component of life. Our struggles determine our successes. So he writes, my friend, choose your struggles wisely, because they ultimately impact your successes in life. And again, we could say, well, he doesn't really know my story, Mike. And you are 100% correct. There may not be anybody else who knows your story. But here's the simple reality. We are all going through stuff. We talk about this regularly as a pastoral staff. Every week as we gather, there are just so many different stories here. There are great stories of really joyful, wonderful things. There are stories of just painful, devastating things. And there's a mix of things between it, right? We are all going through stuff. All different kinds of stuff. But here's the good news. We all have the same opportunity. The opportunity to be wise enough to allow perseverance to finish its work. What if we leaned into that? What if we said, okay, let's do this whole embracing it thing, this New Year's approach, not about, coming up with a New Year's resolution, but actually a different way of approaching life in general, of embracing those struggles, of not avoiding them any longer. This next thing that Manson wrote could be a little touchy for some of us, but I thought it was so important. It's a little longer, but I thought it was important, especially as we're wrapping it up today, to include this. He writes, it turns out that trauma in our lives, in whatever form it takes, isn't actually the thing that makes us stronger. Kind of James said, you do other stuff that makes you stronger. But I want you to stick with me. All those inspirational quotes with cheesy sunsets about enduring adversity and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, they all kind of mislead you into thinking that just enduring some form of hardship is enough to steel yourself against future hardship. This is important. That's not entirely true. It's what comes after the trauma that really matters. It's not the survival of trauma that makes you stronger. It's the extent that we can experience personal growth after trauma that depends a lot on the narrative we construct. And that depends a lot on the narrative we can construct. It's about the story we tell ourselves as we go through it and as we come to the end of it. So as we wrap up today, here's some ideas. Is there a struggle we've been avoiding that we need to embrace? I'm guessing a lot of us have a thing, and it wouldn't take us long to actually come up with that thing. But have we been avoiding it? And is it something we really need to embrace? Is there a struggle we need to be grateful for that we haven't been? And I'm not going to try to offer some suggestions because, again, it could sound very insensitive because I don't know your story. But is there a struggle that maybe we need to change our self-message from or to? Instead of being so unhappy about it, what if we became grateful for it? Because, again, it is doing something in our life. Because what if that's the key to benefiting from it? This idea of James writes, right? Whenever you have, this stuff, whenever this stuff hits you, right? Consider it all joy. James is talking about making a choice, a decision, a mental shift to seeing those things as something that has the possibility to do something for us and to us and in us. Because what if it's not just embracing the pain and struggles, but being grateful for them? Something I hope you'll think about this week.